Thank you. It's an absolute delight to be with you. And I see John Cobb just joined the group. That is a special privilege. I should probably start out noting that the things that I know about economics, though I've taken many economics courses, I learned my real economics course by reading the book that John wrote with Herman Daly, For the Common Good. And if any of you are into economics, that is to me, the authority. Now, it's a real privilege to be with you today. I'm delighted you're having this conversation, and I'm very excited about this framing of the ecological civilization, because the thing I'm going to be focused on is we're at a point in our human experience when we have to be making some very deep changes. And there are very, very few places in our current society where we have the opportunity that you have there to discuss the real depth of the issues and the changes that we're navigating. So it's a great privilege to be meeting with you. And of course, we see this playing out in our politics currently. The politics that are driven by a growing sense of fear and desperation, and increasing evidence that on all sides, all ends of the political spectrum, basically, the vast majority of people no longer trust the system. And that is a time of great instability and uncertainty, great danger, but it also is the opportunity for breakthrough if we can have the kinds of conversations like this that lead us to a new vision. Now, I suspect you've been through much of this, but I always like to start with a couple of statistics that to me really underscore just how bad our current situation is in terms of the failings of what you were noted I often call the suicide economy, because it's destroying the foundations of its own existence. And unfortunately, that takes us humans with it. But the first one is the environmental one that I assume you all know that we're, as a species, we're now consuming at 1.6 times what Earth can sustain. The same, we have a huge portion of the world's population whose basic needs are not being met. And that gets me to the second statistic, which has to do with the number of people that control half of the total of all the world's wealth. In 2010, it was 388 among the richest billionaires owned as much wealth as the poorest half of humanity. That is now down to 62 people own as much wealth as half of humanity for the 2015 figure. So you see the trend there too, that we're of course increasing the burden on the living earth, and we are further dividing it up so that fewer people own more of it. And of course, we still have a growing world population competing for what's left in a rigged and grossly unfair system. So we've got to be working at many levels, and I am a great believer that to get our work right, we need to understand why the system is failing, so that we are working on underlying causes, not just symptoms. Work at all levels, including the theme that's the title of my presentation, Change the Story, Change the Future. And I'll say more about that, why our story is of such fundamental importance. Now, I was thinking last night as I was preparing back to Bill Clinton's famous statement, "It's the economy, stupid." I take that another step forward and say it is the system, stupid. And this is where I get very disturbed about our political debates, which are generally limited to discussing marginal tweaks to kind of fine-tune what is actually a failed system that must be replaced in the most fundamental sense. And I've been recently coming down to just a few fundamental framing statements that to me kind of um, capture the essence of the situation we're in. So the question, why is our global system, our global economy failing? And the very simple answer is because it is by design. It organizes around corporate profits rather than around the well-being of living communities. And if we were to shift our focus from how can we best increase corporate profits to how do we focus on increasing the well-being of living communities, that changes absolutely everything in terms of our the structure of our institutions, the nature of our cultural values, and the kinds of policies that we would organize around. And yet so few of our conversations get down to that simple level, and basically very obvious level. One of the things that kind of embarrasses me sometimes when I'm speaking is that, as I get down to the essence, I realize that there's nothing I'm saying, there's nothing I'm going to tell you that you basically don't already know. And it is such simple, basic, foundational logic that's when I almost scream in frustration that our dominant system and the things we were taught in our university courses, the things we hear on the media, do not touch on these absolute fundamentals. That, if we're going to organize around global corporate profits, we're going to get exactly the results that we're getting. If we would wake up to realize that we are living beings born of and nurtured by a living earth, itself born of a living universe, then we would start thinking and acting in a very different way. And becomes very quickly obvious that a system that is designed and devoted to generating short-term profits absolutely cannot produce long-term well-being of communities. And I should think that's obvious enough that I probably don't need to explain why it's. But what it points to is that we must navigate a deep cultural and institutional transformation that is basically without precedent in the 200,000-year history of Homo sapiens. We've had some dramatic changes over that time, but never anything of the depth and intention and immediacy of what we have to navigate now. And we have to navigate those changes in what would be the blink of an evolutionary eye. We are at this moment at a moment of choice in the human journey. And I think it's sometimes useful to place that in its largest context. That as a species, in a sense, we lived in our childhood in the womb of nature for roughly 190,000 years, where we lived directly off the land, what nature provided. We were with the animals on the plains and the forests, and totally immersed in nature. Then we began to enter into our adolescent rebellion, breaking away from our Mother Earth. And we started out with 5,000 years of settled agriculture, where we began our separation from nature, began to control nature. And then we took a turn to the next 5,000 years of organizing around imperial domination. And this is the period that my book, The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community, focused on, from when the earliest imperial civilizations, where we began to organize under kings and emperors and to rule by armies, began to take hold. And we organized ourselves, controlled ourselves with the military, with colonialism. And then we had a period of liberation from colonialism. This begins to get into my own experience, right after World War II. And I can't see well enough to know how many of you are my generation. I'm kind of, I'm John Cobb's youngster. I'm only 79, but my history goes back to those post-war years when we were liberating the world from colonialism. And then we had the era of development, of economic development, and that's where much of my attention was focused for roughly 30 years, living in Africa, Asia, Latin America, all around the world, trying to bring the secrets of U.S. economics and U.S. business to the rest of the world in the name of ending global poverty and liberating the oppressed peoples of the world. And it was only very slowly that I began to realize that what we call development, international development, economic development, really became a process of recolonization, not under so much the rule of nations, but under the rule of transnational corporations. And this was accomplished through the organizations of the World Bank and the IMF and so forth. The basic scheme is that you get countries deeply into international debt, and then you send in the debt collectors and they restructure the economies and so forth, basically to open them up to corporate exploitation and corporate colonization. And that's what we're seeing playing out. And then from there, it evolved into the use of trade agreements, the World Trade Organization and so forth, to impose the same set of policies that privatize public services, that reduce the taxes on the rich, that suppress the wages and working benefits of workers, and open up all of the world's lands and resources, agriculture, and so forth, and minerals and so forth, to ownership or control by transnational corporations that are basically stateless and that owe no allegiance to any community or human interests other than their own profits. And another thing I realized over time that was happening, and this is part of understanding our current economy, was the transition to monetizing relationships. And this is something that's still ongoing in our own society. That in the original human settlements, human communities, they didn't use money. You grew your own food. You had access to your own land. The water was there. You harvested from the animals from hunting. So the relationships were direct, and the obligations and the exchange and so forth were directly between people and nature and between individuals and people. And much of what was involved in development that is very seldom noted, but it's a process of monetizing those relationships. It was very explicit back when I first started in development that we had to get people off the land. We had to get them into paid employment so they could contribute to the economy. Working in factories and so forth, essentially in sweatshops now as we understand it. And what happens in that process is that people who had control of their own lives in relation to nature and meeting their basic needs become increasingly dependent on money in order to obtain the food, the shelter, the energy, every aspect of modern life. And once you're dependent on money, then you're dependent on the corporations and the banksters that control your access to money, and that also control increasingly the things that you want to buy with the money, which is the most basic level, food and shelter and energy and so forth. So we end up slipping into a condition of servitude to the banksters, to the corporations, and it's a kind of a combination of wage slavery and debt slavery that we have to march to their tune. And another piece of the system I want to mention is that system increasingly operates on autopilot. I mean, we can talk about those richest 62 people. We can talk about the 1% or whatever. They're clearly beneficiaries of that system. And they tend to work with it and manipulate it, but they do not control it. It is not within their means to change it. They're well rewarded as long as they serve it. And that's all part of what we need to understand in terms of the challenge that's before us. Now, in 1972, it somehow seems to be a kind of a defining year. That was the year that Some of you, if you're in my and John's generation, may recall that was the year that the Club of Rome issued their Limits to Growth report. And for many of us, it was a wake up to the reality that economic growth, perpetual economic growth, is an impossibility on a finite Earth. And that was the beginning of that understanding. It also turns out that now the Global Footprint Network, which tracks our relationship between our human demand on Earth and what Earth can sustain, pretty much names 1972 as the year at which we crossed over from living within the generative capacity of Earth to living beyond those means. So that's when we began to really get into the crisis that we're into now. Okay, so we're at a point where we have to navigate. We have to be making some very, very serious choices that we have to make as a species. And the individual things that we do and that you're doing, the things that are local, are very foundational to this, and I'll say more about why. But we also have to recognize that we're really dealing with a situation of a choice that we have to make as a species. And this is where I think it's interesting to understand that part of our nature, because we, in a very real sense, we humans we organize around our shared stories. And when we get our story wrong, our story about our own nature, about the nature of reality, about the nature of the economy, when we get those stories wrong, we get our future wrong. And currently, as you may be aware, we have our stories very badly wrong. And a big piece of that is the economics that we have wrong, that John Cobb and Herman Daly, some years back, really helped wake up many of us too. So here we are, now a global species facing a profound choice. As we move forward, do we continue to organize ourselves around the short-term profits of stateless transnational corporations? Or do we break away from that and begin to say, well, wait a minute, what we really need to be concerned about is the long-term health of living communities. Now, I don't have to tell you which of these choices the architects of the corporate-ruled global economy have chosen. And we've already touched on the implications, which you're all familiar with and which we live with daily. Now, getting deeper into the stories. The story that we currently live by, I call the sacred money and market story. This whole issue of what do we consider to be most sacred in the sense of being the most important, the most essential to our well-being. And this is the story that we are constantly told. If you take a conventional economics course, it is what you will study. It's the implication underlying most of our business reports and so forth. It starts out, time is money. If any of you have been to business school, almost everything you're taught in school is all around the frame of time is money. Money is wealth, and making money creates the defining purpose of work, the defining purpose of business and the economy. And then we hear richer societies, wealth creators. Their affluent lifestyles are simply their fair and just reward for their contribution to the benefit of society. Material consumption drives prosperity. We serve our public duty by consuming more. And consumption is the path to happiness. Yes, they're poor people, but that's a consequence of their laziness. They just get to work, they get along fine. Earth belongs to us. It's our human nature to be individualistic, competitive, acquisitive. And here's where we're so fortunate that, guided by the invisible hand of the free market, the unfettered by regulation, these beneficial traits, or acquisitive, competitive, individualistic traits, unleash the creative potentials of humanity grow the economy, create wealth, end poverty, and drive the technological advances that are required to eliminate our dependence on nature. The community interest is simply an aggregation of the individual private interests of its individual members. We therefore all do best when we each seek only to maximize our own private financial gain. Corporations, as Mitt Romney told us, they're just people. They're working in common cause, they're engines of wealth creation, and they should be entitled to the same rights as any person. Now, have any of you ever heard this story before? Raise your hand if you ever heard this story. Is any of it true? Not a single piece of it is true. Not a single piece. And yet that is the story around which we organize. Now, given the level of this group, I want to go just a little bit deeper here into the deeper stories, our cosmologies, our Western cosmologies, that are the source of our deepest understanding of our nature and the nature of reality, and how those set the stage for us accepting this sacred money and market story.
David, this is Philip. I just want to make sure that we get to your story, and they really want to dialogue with you.
The first one.
What?
Okay. Well, I'm sort of timing this on the basis of, well, I'll do this very quickly on the basis of when we actually started. There are three basic Western cosmologies. One is the distant patriarch, which is the story that all that is by God's will. God is all powerful. That the purpose of this life is to essentially understand God's will, get at his good side, to get a place in the afterlife. Now, I know that the Christianity of John Cobb and a lot of the more progressive Christians go beyond this, but this is kind of the more standard story. And we even get into God wants you to be rich and so forth. It puts us into a situation of external dependence. If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, everything is by his will. And if he wants it changed, he will change it. So it, in a sense, absolves us of responsibility. The third story is the grand machine story, which is that everything is just simply a matter of mechanism and chance playing out, that there is no agency. The consciousness is an illusion. Life is nothing more than consciousness is nothing more than an accidental outcome of material complexity. Which puts us into a universe in which we are totally alone, a universe without meaning, very, very depressing. If you really get into that, come out and think, wow, I think I'll go shopping. And it basically, that meaninglessness leaves us open to the advertisers that say, okay, our product will bring you happiness and fulfillment and so forth. The third cosmology is the mystical unity, which teaches that the ego is an illusion, that everything is simply the undifferentiated spirit. In its most fundamental form, it also strips away meaning and puts us into a kind of an escape mode to merge into darkness, into oneness. And none of these three cosmologies really invite us to be participants in an unfolding creative process that brings deep meaning to our lives and to our existence. And it sets us up for giving up meaning and focusing around an economy that is devoted to maximizing short-term profits, and that leads us into maximizing financial returns to people who already have money, which assures that those people will get richer relative to the rest of society, it leads into externalizing costs for short-term gain, including environmental costs, social costs, and so forth. And then all of the complicated financial games that Wall Street institutions play, all for the purpose of essentially creating money out of nothing without making any contribution of any kind beneficial to humanity. Now, the deeper story, cosmology, is I call the living universe cosmology, which is that it does start out, the whole of creation starts out with a spiritual intelligence, a consciousness that is seeking to know itself through a creative process of becoming, and is constantly evolving toward greater complexity, beauty, awareness, and possibility, which then gives us the basis for a sacred life and living earth story, which goes something like this. Time is money. I'm sorry, that's the old story. Time is life. I mean, really sock this one away. I keep coming back to this. It is so fundamental. Is our frame. Time is money. Time is our life. Time is the time here. It is our being. So is time money? Is it about money? Or is time life? Is our time about living? And I don't know any 6 words that more fundamentally frame the choice before us. Now, within that frame, we see real wealth as living wealth. We recognize money as nothing but a number, which is useful as a medium of exchange. But that we humans, in fact, are living beings born of and nurtured by a living earth, which is itself born of an evolving living universe. And the whole of creation that we're part of is an unfolding process in which we are not the victims, we are participants, and ideally we are contributors to that positive unfolding. Then we begin to see also, as we get deeper into ecology and the leading edges of biology, that life exists only in community. It can only exist in community because life itself, and we see this in the earliest stages of Earth's evolution, and we see it, of course, playing out in what's happening with climate change and so forth, that when it's healthy, Earth organizes to create and maintain the surface conditions of the environment that are essential to the existence of all life, including our own. And this is why when we start messing with Earth's natural systems by overloading the atmosphere with carbon and all the other things that we're doing, why it is such a deep crisis, such a deep sin against life and against the whole of creation. And this is, to me, part of the ecological civilization that part of it is moving from our exploitation of nature to becoming part of the creative unfolding, living in balance with Earth's natural systems, helping Earth heal, helping life continue on. And it's not a matter of coming to a static situation, but understanding that trajectory of evolution toward greater complexity, beauty, awareness, and possibility, and what is our role in that. And this is where coming to organize like life organizes in living communities, that at every level we're getting into regenerative agriculture, that we're getting into circular economies in which every matter, energy, water, nutrients are all continuously regenerating and continuously recycling and meeting our needs. We are moving, I don't think we'll ever get rid of money, and money is a perfectly beneficial and useful human institution if we recognize that it is just an accounting shed. It's a tool, and use it accordingly. But the most important thing is rebuilding the direct relationships of caring and interaction and mutual exchange and support, both among ourselves and between ourselves and Earth. That is the essence of what I assume most of you are actually doing in much of your activist work. And of course, the other piece is working to change the policies and so forth that strengthen the rights and power of global corporations increase our dependence on money rather than reducing that dependence and strengthening the rights of communities. And we come down to essentially four foundational pillars of change. One is changing the underlying story, which we've been talking about, bringing forth and celebrating the sacred life and living earth story. In the whole area of economics, if we think of economics as the science and the methodology by which we understand our relationships to one another on earth, by which we create our means of living, we need to move from an economics that is grounded in finance and move to an economics that is grounded in an advancing science of ecology. Then we come to the fundamental changes in law. If you're paying attention to what's going on in the law and how our laws currently work, it turns out that from Supreme Court rulings and so forth, corporations have more rights in law than real living people do, and nature has no rights. Here's another one of these just simple formulas. Without nature, there are no people. And with no people, there are no corporations. And yet we give corporations more rights than people, and we give nature no rights at all. So we have the whole legal system upside down, backwards. The thing that absolutely has to be inviolate is the health and well-being of nature. That establishes the foundation of our health and well-being, and then we recognize that corporations are nothing but a tool. They're created by people, they're created by the state by issuing a charter, and there's absolutely no reason for their existence except to serve the common good, to serve the human interest, to serve the community interest. And that gives us a basis on which we've got to fundamentally rethink the whole institution of the corporation. And as I'm beginning to write about now, we essentially need to eliminate the whole institutional frame of the transnational corporation. And then that gets us down to ownership, that is being increasingly concentrated, increasingly delinked from community, and ownership needs to be rooted in community. And I often say this is a point that both Karl Marx and Adam Smith agreed on, that workers should own their means of production, or that every person should own the means of creating their livelihood or have a stake in it. That plays out in cooperative ownership and so forth. The change that we need is not going to come from within the system. It's going to come through citizen action, and that's what you're there talking about. So with that, I'll wrap this up, and we can turn it to discussion wherever you want to take it.
Thank you so much, Dave. We'd love to have times of open discussion, so I'll simply move to the back and point to people and let them ask whatever they want to ask. It's a great resource to have you here, and we'd love to probe you from the perspective of these last 2 days of our discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you for this image of the story. And my question that I've sort of been asking everyone here throughout the conference has been, we all know, all of us here know this story is a mistake. But why do the people in power, at least in our country and throughout the world, want that story and like that story and refuse to listen to anything else? Because I think they're just as smart as we are to know that it's false. It's something, I mean, is it just sheer greed or you know, why is it so hard for people to see that they're making that mistake?
A very good question. How many people have you heard tell you it's false? I mean, you know it's false. You know it in your heart it's false. Just like we know in our heart of hearts, we're born with it. It's part of indigenous wisdom. It's part of who we are, that we are living beings, and we are born of a living earth. And yet it's not the story we hear. And I think this is part of being human, where it's part of our ability to work together in groups or as tribes or as villages or societies, that we're sort of wired to live by our cultural stories. So once a cultural story becomes established, it's actually quite difficult to change, because everybody's buying into it, and anybody that challenges it is considered a little odd. I mean, have you ever stood up, tried to stand up in an economics course and tell a professor this is a bunch of bullshit? You know, it's hard to believe when you step back, and once you get it, and we're in a group like this, and we're all talking about it, and we all recognize that it's all bullshit. And yet, how often do we stand up and actually say that in public, or hear somebody else say it, and then applaud them for it? It can be hard to do, and yet it's absolutely what we need to do. And one of the things I find amazing and reassuring, it was not easy for me to stand up and start doing that originally. I assume it wasn't for John Cobb either. But pretty soon you realize, oh, well, most people get it instantly. It's not even controversial. So maybe I should be more upfront about speaking what I know to be true.
Yes, John.
You know, the other piece, of course, of your question is that the elites are, you know, at least the more rapacious elites. I mean, there are a lot of very rich people who are extremely thoughtful and could join right in this conversation. But a disproportionate of them, a number of those in corporate power and banksters, I'm absolutely convinced are sociopaths and psychopaths, way out of proportion to their normal number in the population. And these are people who are absolutely unable, I would hate to mention Donald Trump, but are of that kind of personality that are so narcissistic that this story really works for them, and they're not about to challenge it.
So you've got John.
Anyhow.
To carry on further this point, Goebbels said that if you tell a lie often enough and loud enough, that people will come to believe it. And we have corporate and state power that's spending billions and billions of dollars to perpetuate this lie. So the question is, how do we begin to undermine it, to sabotage it? We probably can't overthrow it.
I don't know if you can. Okay, starting to come back. You all froze and things went silent for a moment.
So John,
I just heard the reference to Goebbels said, and then it cut out.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay. Given the inordinate amount of billions of dollars that are being spent by corporations and the state to perpetuate this lie, how do we undermine it? How do we overthrow it? How do we sabotage it? We probably can't overthrow it, but how do we move forward given the inordinate power we push against here?
Yeah, I mean, this seems simplistic, but just saying it. Just saying it. I mean, speaking the truth every time you get an opportunity, organizing discussions like this one. It's the only way I know to change it. You know, I could say, you know, hand people one of my books, particularly the latest one, which is Change the Story, Change the Future, where it's all very simple. If they're into economics, have them read For the Common Good.
But the inculcation of this story begins as we even learn to read and watch TV as little kids.
Yeah, no, it's insidious. Now, one of the things I have hoped, and every once in a while I get my hope up, that potentially our churches and our institutions, our faith institutions, which to me are institutions for examining the deepest questions about our nature, that these are obvious places to hold this conversation. And I have no idea how many of you in this group are affiliated with a congregation of one kind or another. And I know that despite my hope and despite knowing that, you know, many places like the School of Theology there at Claremont University, at least the faculty and the thinkers are having these kinds of discussions all of the time. But I often find once it actually gets out in the churches, the pastors are so nervous about offending their rich congregants who they're absolutely dependent on, they're afraid to have these kind of conversations. But I think we have to overcome that fear. I don't know of any other institution that is better positioned to have the conversation, because it's all, and it seems to me all of what we're talking about here is just absolutely aligned with what Jesus taught, and should be a fundamental part of our teachings in our faith institutions. I particularly enjoy the interfaith movement activities in this regard, because I think that absolutely moves in the right direction. That to get this right, you know, we have the knowledge, but we need to be drawing from every source of human knowledge and the insights of the different faiths. We need to be bringing in the insights of science without getting caught up in science's, in a sense, articles of faith, that it's all just mechanism. It's kind of a useful set of assumptions for science. But if you think about it, science has never proved that there's no such thing as consciousness and intelligence in the universe. It just assumed it because it helps discipline the scientific method. But again, fortunately, more and more scientists are beginning to break free from that, and there should be just enormous opportunity for discussion between faith communities and leaders in the faith community and leaders in the scientific community. John, did you? Yeah.
I have been very encouraged by the Roman Catholic leadership, meaning the present Pope and Laudato Si. And if I were answering the question, I would point to that as at the moment the most promising thing. But how do you feel about that?
Oh, absolutely. I'm thinking of becoming a Catholic. I think it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
Oh, please. If you want to, yeah, walk over a little bit so you can see you.
Hello, sorry, I was sitting off on the side, but.
Can you hear all right? Yeah. Yeah. There you go.
I'm having a hard time hearing.
Is this more audible?
Yeah, it's kind of broken up, but the closer you can get to a speaker, the better, or I mean a microphone, the better.
Okay.
There you go. There you go.
It's over the range.
Now I can see you too. Good.
Thank you so much, sir. And I guess I would start prefacing myself as one of those persons who's still having questions about which of the stories is true, and perhaps I'm leaning towards some aspects of the
Could you get a little closer to the microphone? It's still breaking up a bit.
So if you stood just on John's right, or sat there, then you can. Other side. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, to repeat what I said, that I am perhaps one of those people who is still having questions about which of the stories is true. And for myself, I actually feel like that I came from believing that the new story that, you know, time is life, not time is money, story was true. And I was actually a Catholic, and I'm not. But I am having, I do not know which I land on more. And, you know, when I think, for example, some of my reasons for believing that, I just feel, I look back, for example, at you mentioned these phases of that human history has gone through, right? When we were in the womb of the earth and we were living a certain way, and then we began our rebellious adolescence, and now here we are. So to me, I guess maybe I didn't understand whether you were saying that these are necessary processes, right? I believe is your point, that we're going towards a more complex system, but that perhaps like all of us young people, we need to go through our rebellious.
Ah, you're back.
Can you give him the bottom line of your question if we get him again? So
Yeah.
Give me the bottom line. I missed the bottom line.
cut off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, just I don't know where we stopped hearing, but essentially that perhaps this is a process that we need to go through. You know, the moving away from the land. I don't know that I believe Jared Diamond, for example, I think really famous, the worst mistake in the history of the human race, moving away from agriculture. Moving towards agriculture, right? I think you weren't proposing that as true, but when I look at just the possibilities we had back then the life expectancy is one thing, right? Maybe 40 years of a good life is good, but some of the suffering and particularly physical suffering, we endured, none of the medical advances that we could even have dreamed of. And just, it seems to me that, if this is the process we have to go through, can there be good can there be bad in the process with the end outcome still be good? Like, this rebellion, this exploitation of capitalism, etc. So that for me would answer perhaps a little bit the question of which of the stories is true. Does that make sense of it?
Okay. You kept breaking up, so I'm not sure I totally understood you, but if I understood correctly, you're asking, might there have been a benefit from the 5,000 years of empire and our separation from our early roots with Earth?
Whether you think that was a necessary evil per se?
Yeah. I think it's a very profound question, and it's one that I ask myself, and I think that may be the case. It's actually why I kind of like the analogy of adolescence in terms of our individual growing up and maturing. That it is absolutely essential to our adult role that we make that break with our parents and our original family and find our place of independence. And in order, one could say that if the purpose of all of this is this continued creative unfolding of creation, that the human, I sometimes think of our situation, that we humans are creation's most daring experiment in the creative potentials of reflective consciousness. The potentials of a mind that knows that it knows, can step back and look at itself, and that ultimately this relates to our ability to organize around stories. But to exercise our full potential and our full intelligence, we also have to recognize that our stories are stories. The story is not the reality. So that we do exactly what we're doing now. We say, oh, well, this is the story that we seem to be living around. Let me step back and say, does that conform to my deepest understanding of reality? There's kind of two tests. Does it conform to reality? And two, is it working? Is it beneficial? Does it lead us toward choices that make life better for all of us and improve our being? And we probably, as a species, had to go through this time of separation, which allowed us to develop the science that in turn allows us to peer into the deepest processes of creation, and to gain the insight that what looks like solid matter is not solid matter. Solid matter is an illusion, and even that, I kind of like the idea that in some ways only relationships are real. The individual doesn't even exist. And particularly with, yeah.
We've hit our absolute limit on time. We're going to let Bill Lesher ask a final question, and then we're going to have to say goodbye.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, David, thank you for what you've introduced to us here and all that you've done up to this point. I was really fascinated by your mention of the interreligious movement as a potential entry point here. And I'd like to have you expand on that a little bit further. You know, it seems to me that the institutional religion is caught in the same trap that society is caught in. It's, you know, you mentioned the problem of a pastor preaching truth to a congregation. You know, have to be bold to do that, and you're going to be prophetic and probably lose your job. So, you know, we're in the same institutional religion that's caught in that trap. But the interreligious movement is not. It's fresh, it's new, it's on the edge, it's, you know, bringing in ideas from all over. But I just wondered, are you in conversation with any of the centers of interreligious activity to think? I think of these great institutions as keepers of a story, keepers of a story, keepers of their own story, and now they need to be keeping a new story, and it needs to be a corporate story, it needs to be a civilizational story. Are you in touch with any of these groups that are working at that edge? And if not, what
I think one of them is the group that organizes around John Cobb right there. And I don't know any of the groups that I'm associated with that has more reach. And I don't know if have I got that right, John? But that's very foundational to what they're doing.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking, David, of, for example, there's the Parliament of the World's Religion, which is a major. There's a United Religions Initiative out of San Francisco. There's a Religions for Peace in New York City. These are international organizations that are at kind of the cutting edge of bringing the religions of the world together. You know, I'm very interested in bringing these groups together and engaging this conversation.
I think you're absolutely right on. I do not have connections